Before we get started, I wanted to give a big shout out to Sage Audio for helping me source this video. Be sure to check the links in the description for more information and for a free mastering sample. Thanks! What is this one? Saturation? No. Digital distortion. Yeah, tube and tape? No. Oh no. Analog mastering. That's one, yeah. So stand by.
Picasso is dead. Steve Jobs is dead. Walt Disney is dead.
Hey guys, it's Professor. Great to see you guys again, even if it's been a minute. I've been busy making some new tracks that you guys have probably heard, Ignite and Drifting, the past 2 weeks. I hope you guys checked them out. If not, go check them out and then come back to this video, because during the creation of these projects, I delved really deep into some new sound engineering concepts that I wanted to share with you guys today. Alright, so I did some studying, and sometimes as producers, it's our job to know what certain tools will do to certain sounds, and then we try to find the right outlet to achieve the sound, and to be sure we are using our ears to pass critical judgment on what benefits our track. You guys will have to bear with me. I have a ton of notes here in front of me, so I'm gonna be like reading off of them as we talk. During the creation of Drifting, I specifically began to look more into analog sound processing, and whether we realize it or not, the fundamentals of analog tools are all around us. Even in the digital atmosphere, I'm sure you have been using one of the synths, or one of your synths at some point, and seen a type of saturation option, or maybe a plugin with saturation, maybe an exciter or a filter effect option. More than likely, if you mess with one of these, you will see different options like scream, tube, tape, digital, analog, etc. These things are in Serum, these things are in Massive, these things are in plugins, they're in DLLs, they're effects, these concepts are everywhere. And I was very curious about what these came from. And I'm sure you've seen different plugins for saturation and just used it knowing that it would make your sound more full. That's what saturation does. A great example of this in FL Studio is Maximus, or more specifically Soundgoodizer. It uses some saturation. In general, this is true, but have you ever wondered why or how the saturation works? Well, these algorithms or formulas are special sound processing. The specific ones I wanted to talk about today are the ones based on the analog age, and many of these saturators nowadays will try to emulate how these analog tools worked. Analog sound has a long-standing spot in our hearts, and whether we realize it or not, it's being used. Specifically, the two I wanted to talk today about were tube and tape saturation. And emulating this can be very valuable, or using it in songs. That's why FabFilter tube saturation costs freaking $150, Jesus Christ! What the heck? Alright, so even now there are mastering engineers in this day that choose to specifically use analog tools when mastering, due to the richness and warmth that these tools can bring to a track. I was very curious about if Drifting, the song I made because of its acoustical nature, would have benefited from an analog master or an analog processing. So I did a lot of research into what went on with all this stuff, and let's start here. You might not even know it, but you've probably heard artists or producers that choose to have their tracks mastered in analog. A big example is Futuristic, the YouTube rapper. You probably know him from The Greatest, or just any of his other things with a bunch of views. Specifically, he has worked with Sage Audio, the people I'm going to be referencing a lot today because they helped me out with a lot of information, and they mastered my track Drifting for me. So I'm going to specifically be talking because I learned a lot from there and some other resources. So Futuristic is an example of a modern day artist that sees the value and potential in analog mastering. Now, not one is better than the other when we come to talk about digital mastering versus analog mastering. There's just benefits to each different one, and if you're curious about either, it's great that you're here because I'm going to explain my opinion and what I learned on them, kind of go into a history, and, having that information in your brain will help you make these steps towards that final goal track with that specific polished sound. What kind of polish do you want on it? What do you want it to sound like? We're going to go into the effects and all this stuff. Sorry, I'm rambling. Alright, so recently I had one of my tracks mastered on an analog system, but I want to share with you guys the reasons why I chose to do this, how I came to the decision, and how I knew it would and how it did complement and cement the overall final sound I wanted for my production. We're going to briefly touch on the ideas of mastering again. We've covered that in this channel before, but not to a degree like today, as well as the differences and benefits of both digital and audio mastering and how you can expect them to influence your sound. So if you guys are ready, let's hop right in. The difference between audio in the digital world and audio in the analog world. Let's start with this first. In the digital world, everything has to be calculated with a specific value. We know this from programming. We know this from art. Everything is a number, even if it comes down to 1 or 0. But in general, the same with audio when we work in our digital audio workshops, our DAWs. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing because we luckily have technology with tons of sample rates. Like, you listen to like 44,000 samples per second half the time with high quality audio. Can you imagine 44,000 pieces of information in 1 second? All of that's entering your ear when you listen to a 44.1 kilohertz track. And then there's wave bit depth, things like 32, and all of this has to just go down to how the sound is put and tracked and just like pretty much etched into rather stone or rather than on a CD, how it's etched as a digital file, a WAV or an MP3, and WAV will probably be what we talk about mostly here. In the digital world, everything has to be calculated. It has to have a specific value represented in bit depth and sample rate. I'll show you guys some charts here to show you, only briefly, just give you guys a visual example. But in the analog world, or the real world, there is no defined values. There's no reason to give a value to something that's not being digitally processed. So let's use a visual example to talk about analog audio. Let's take a look at this blank circle over here, all right? This circle, imagine the inside the circle is the realm of which audio can exist and its limits. Now, within this, it could be any point can be chosen here on this circle, right? There's an infinite amount of points to represent where something can exist in this image or in this audio. There's nothing being tracked other than where it is. But now let's look at how audio is handled digitally. We'll turn the circle into a dartboard. This visually represents the audio information in a digital form, where this value could have been, here on the analog part, it needs to now be rounded to a number. But specifically, in a digital world, it's gonna have like a 1,000 more values than just these. But we've now defined specific points, and this is what happens when we use audio in the digital world. And it's what the nature of digital is. It's it makes sense when you look at it finally, and it's like, okay, that's cool. The question is like, what does that even mean? Now, I use the above example, guys, because I want us to understand the basic principles behind these two different places in which audio exists before we move any further. All right, so let's talk about mastering. At what mastering is in its most essential and fundamental practices. It's preparing an audio track for distribution across different media formats and sources. Audio engineering goes as far back as forever ago, early 1900s, I think. But until the introduction of tape recording, most master recordings were always cut direct to disc. In the late 1940s, the recording industry was revolutionized by the introduction of magnetic tape. Now, this is probably what you imagine when you imagine an old school audio recording or tape or something in the studio. Let's zoom forward to 1957. And finally, after skipping other events, now we're at 1957, the stereo vinyl record came onto the market. Mastering engineers began to apply techniques to make records louder. Loudness led to better radio playback and higher record sales. Ironically enough, this marked the birth of the loudness wars that is still going on today. But streaming services have been battling that back for a while now, and it's a moot point. We aren't going to go over that overplayed topic today. We're not here to learn about the loudness wars. As tools became more versatile and not just capable but special, sound and mastering engineers were able to effect these final tracks coming to them more and more. Some began to use a certain flair or special techniques they had acquired over time with their tools and specialized knowledge. In short, this practice is now more than ever, at least in my opinion, used in the digital age, where we expect a pre-master to be at least -3 decibels peaking so that the mastering engineer has headroom to work with. Ways to clean up sound, add or subtract levels from specific frequencies, use parallel compression to control certain frequency peaks, and even add these tube, dioid, tape, analog, digital, saturation, compression, transients, excitement to the track, and the list of possibilities goes on and on, really, especially if you understand how these tools interact with audio. Now, this brings us to different mastering techniques. Let's begin with something simple, like this track here. Digital mastering tends to preserve detail and transients in the higher frequencies and spectrums. This makes it a popular choice for EDM tracks, especially when you consider that EDM tracks are primarily electronically engineered and generated. Values are tracked and kept. Digital mixing technology lends itself naturally well to the genre. One interesting thing is that even in some of the highest end mastering tools, we will see a place for analog emulation, and I'll show you that here. I have Ozone. Ozone is like a standard or is like a very professional mastering tool, and you can see over here in the exciter that we have spots for tube, analog, warm, digital, tape, tube, all these different things are available here, and they aim to emulate the sound you would get from the past. Now, you're wondering, where the heck, what is tube? What is tape? How does that saturation even work? Like, am I shoving my audio through a tube? That's like what I thought back in the day. The problem is that's not the case. There's actually a lot more going on behind the hood when you're looking at these things. Let's look at this next part on my notes. All right. Now, what these options you see right here, and I'm going to show you, mentioned above, are algorithms attempting to emulate very special and valued analog sounds. There are some specific hallmarks from the analog age that are prized and preferred. It's almost like having a wine that gets better with age, but it's already great. There's a richness to it, a warmth or fullness to the taste. There's something that develops and is appreciated in that sense. Now, tape and tube. Tape and tube. These are the two I want to talk about today. When recording was primarily done on tape, it was electromagnetic tape. A recording engineer would record audio onto it and work with it, etc., rinse and repeat. Eventually, the tape would be used again for a new recording. The interesting thing here is that eventually, with the extended use of the tape, its limit would be reached and would need to be replaced. But before this, the tape retains small traces of information from past recordings, as well as being affected by the real analog world, like dust or warmth, how it warps hardware, or just in general things around it. It's like when they say, don't leave this in hot sun, store in cool temperatures.
Don't leave your records in the sun. They get all wavy and they just won't run. They just won't play, just won't play, just won't play, just won't play, just
Things like this would result in a mixture of barely audible distortion, phase irregularities, micro pitch shifting, and harmonic transients popping out across the entire frequency spectrum, and it sounds great. Mixing engineers discovered that they could print to tape even hotter than normal in the range of soft clipping to further amplify these pleasurable sounds. It creates a wall or a haze that's barely noticeable, unlike digital recordings where everything is superbly isolated. The sound that a tape generates is described as warm, and we can see how this might be reflected when we run a basic sine wave through a tape emulation. And I'm going to show you guys that here now. So, let's look. We have a basic sine wave. We're listening to it. But now, let's run it through two different tape emulating saturators. I have neutron elements. Look, as we drive the sine wave through more, different frequencies are being generated up across the spectrum. We start to see them pop up in the thousands, 2000s, and further and further and further. This is an emulation of what tape saturation would do to a sound. And it doesn't sound bad. It doesn't sound great. It's just, imagine what happens when we use this type of sound manipulation across a whole thing. That's what we call saturation to your instruments. You know, it's why it's something that you want to stick out. You put a little more. It has some harmonic frequencies that are generated in different areas. It's a little bit more forward. It sounds nice. Let's take a look at... Because it is so liked for its warm sound, it's been replicated and used all over the place. But when we reach a true analog system, it does not need to be emulated, or remember, even digitally valued. This warmth can come off true and is what some listeners or sound engineers absolutely adore when hearing something. Now, let's talk about tube saturation. And I think apparently tube saturation is more favored. I don't know. But now let's look at tube saturation. Tube saturation plugins emulate the sound of audio driven through tube amps. They introduce even order harmonics. This type of harmonic distortion also adds a subtle form of compression. However, when pushed hard, tube saturation can have an aggressive edge. Many describe tube saturation as sounding warm, musical, and punchy. This type of harmonic distortion can also increase perceived loudness, dimension, and fatness. Now let's look at that here above. We see extra, or at least to me, it looks like we're getting some harmonic being generated, and I can see where even some more subtle harmonics are being generated when we push this sine wave through. This sound attempts to emulate the sound from true analog tube hardware. Now, in the analog world, it is more like this. Tube saturation occurs when no more electrons can transfer from the cathode to the anode. due to the increasingly positive charge of grid in between them. I'll reference this picture right here from Sage Audio's blog. When we run our sine wave through these exciters, we can hear this happening to the sound. The more we drive through, the more pronounced it is. In general, mild to low levels of tube saturation can be used to warm up an otherwise cold sounding track, giving certain frequencies or sound more color. Now, these two saturations are just two of my favorite ones, which is why I wanted to touch on them. We can hear how they affect sound and even imagine how they could be used now. Now, these concepts and this research here all mentioned is what made me so curious about true analog mastering. Could true analog mastering bring that richness or warmth to my sound that even I might not be able to emulate with digital mastering? I personally thought it would benefit from true analog mastering. So, this is why I've reached out to an analog master, or an analog mastering studio that has reputable demos that you can see here if you go onto their website and listen. They've been doing this for a long time. And after researching the head of the studio and how he's worked with Futuristic, I was like, I'm sold. Like, I want to see what can be just, this is the final decision as a producer. This is where I want my track to be finished. Let's listen and look at this unmastered version of Drifting. Or let's look at this Drifting instrumental. This track has lots of classic elements to it. It's almost as though the skeleton holding the track feels classic, while the details come off a bit modern or atmospheric. Knowing this, as I mixed and detailed the track, I wanted to add richness to the sound. I was researching how old saxophone performances were recorded and treated, and I wanted to emulate that sound. I used some tools from Isotope's Neutron plugin, mixing plugin, to accomplish this. Then, eventually, when attempting to master the track, I was looking at the Exciter tool in Ozone Advanced, right here. I saw again these tube and tape tools and messed around with them. I realized though that for this track I wanted that rich sound to be true and organic. After more research and studying, I eventually came across a genius blog by Sage Audio where I learned some of the fundamentals and details behind analog mastering. After reading these articles, I decided I wanted this engineer and his setup to be the final stage on this track. One amazing thing I will say, guys, is that Sage Audio offers a free mastering sample service, and I was even able to check out the demos of some pre-masters versus final master songs they had done. If you guys want to check them out, you can go here to the link in the or just actually go check it out. Go hit those links in the description. With all of the research done and the demos listened to, I decided I knew what I wanted to do next with my track. I made the final touches in the mix, and then I sent the track to Sage Audio's engineers. I got a sample master back. I was digging into it, and to say the least, I went ahead, listened to it, and I was like, great, this is exactly what I want for my sound. Let's finish the whole thing.
I feel like I'm drifting away and I'm stuck in my ways. Feel like I'm losing the day. I feel like I need me a pound. I'll break right down, then I'll be smoking it down and cruising around, recycle, repeating the night. Yeah, feel like I'm living a life and there's never been doubt in my sight.
In short, guys, there really is no right or wrong answer when it comes to making your music, but it does help us a lot as producers to be knowledgeable about the tools we have available to us. And when I was looking for some information about this topic, I couldn't find as much as I wish was available online, which is why I made this video today. And I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like and comment something interesting you found out about it. Don't forget to share it if you know anyone who might enjoy this. And hit that subscribe button for more great content like this, guys. Again, a big thanks to Sage Audio for providing a lot of information for me, checking my notes for me, making sure that I was giving you guys accurate information about everything. Be sure to go show them some love on their YouTube channel. Link is in the description. They have some great technical information when it comes to analog hardware, digital mastering in general. If you want to know something, you might be able to find it there. Anyways, guys, Thanks so much. I'm glad to be back making videos, and I can't wait to see you guys again on the next one. Like and subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them below. And until then, guys, keep grinding, all right? Take it easy. This has been Professor. Peace.
I feel like I'm drifting away and I'm stuck in my ways. Feel like I'm losing the day. I feel like I need me a pound. I'll break right down, then I'll be smoking it down and cruising around, recycle, repeating the night. Yeah, feel like I'm living a life, and there's never been doubt in my sight, huh? El Chapo with the pesos and a long clip with the Draco, and I walk around with that poncho, cause